All right, everybody, welcome. This is a roundtable discussion that we're going to be having on the subject of, if I can just quote the roundtable's title, Securing Our Democratic Informational Environment. I know that sounds like a super light topic, but we've got some really great people to sort of start us off with some interventions here. And let me just sort of suggest what we're doing. I mean, the idea of this roundtable is to really be an interactive opportunity for people to put some ideas on the table and then to have discussion around them. The organizers kind of set us up with two kinds of subjects, but I'm thinking that we'll sort of see how it goes, see where people are interested in having a conversation, and then we'll sort of go from there. Let me just say a couple of words. So first, I'm David Kay. I teach law at UC Irvine in Southern California. And for 6 years, I was the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. During that time, I think as everybody in the room knows, we saw this new idea, which was an old idea, like an old new idea of fake news, disinformation. It obviously all came to the fore in a very direct way in 2016. People sort of focused on it after the Brexit votes and after the election of Donald Trump. So we can't put the politics in some box, for disinformation. It's very much a part of why the public is so focused on it. And the public is focused on this, as I think everybody in this room is focused on it, because we perceive a kind of harm that may be difficult to define as a legal matter, at least, but a kind of harm to our public institutions, to access to information, to basically the way in which we have conversations and learn about the world around us. And obviously, it has never been worse in some respects than the environment since October 7th. And you hardly have to go online, because of course everything online gets fed into the mainstream media as well, to see the degree to which we are facing disinformation, manipulation, other forms of, whether it's information warfare or just misinformation, that is having a big impact on our work, and on our democratic space. So that's sort of to frame a bit what we're talking about, and we have two separate kinds of issues that have been presented for us. The first issue is existing and potential threats to trust and stability in the information sphere. And the second is reconciling effective action, democratic shareholding, and multi-stakeholder cooperation in the governance of online content. And we are going to do this all in 56 minutes and 45 seconds. And so what I'd like to ask, so the way we've organized, the way the organizers have sort of structured this is, we have a set of people who will make interventions to get our conversation started, and then we'll open it up to discussion. I'm going to try to keep a very close eye on this recording here, on the clock. This is a recorded session, so it's not being live streamed, but it is a recorded session, so keep that in mind, for whatever that's worth. I mean, I always forget and come to regret it. And you should come to regret it too. I want this to be a place where you regret that you said this in a public, I mean, that's right.
Total freedom of expression.
Complete freedom of expression, right? No resistance whatsoever. So for the first subject, what I want to ask people to do is, rather than me giving, everybody who has been sort of given one of these cards, I could spend a long time introducing, because the sort of the level of expertise is really intense in this room, and the resumes that support that are very long. Rather than me introducing, I'm just going to go to a name, go to a person, and ask you just to say what your current affiliation is, and then launch into, let's say, no more than 3 minutes, if we can limit it to that, to an introduction of the topic that that you want to sort of put on the table for the issue of disinformation, if that makes sense. And, we'll play this by ear a little bit. We'll see, feel free to junk what you were going to say and make it responsive to something that somebody else said. Okay, I spoke for longer than I should have. Can I first turn to Eileen Donahoe?
Okay, so thank you.
And hit this.
I now work for the government, and yet I still believe in my own free expression. And so I will do my best, and I thought I had 4, and I was given a script, but I will signal me on 3. So I recently rejoined the State Department as Special Envoy for Digital Freedom, and basically my top-line mission is to inject democratic values and international human rights law and principles into U.S. cyber, digital, and tech policy. Big picture. Information integrity and addressing challenges specifically related to digital technology in the global information realm is one of my 3 pillars. The other 2 are values-based international AI governance and digital inclusion, sort of the positive side of technology. I can say many things about how seriously and genuinely people in the U.S. government take this issue, notwithstanding our political context and our constitutional problems, First Amendment problems, et cetera. And that includes the president and the secretary, who want us to get creative and be practical. So I really appreciate the framing of this that David already brought up, which is solutions-oriented and, you know, addressing this really is the threat to democracy. You know, it is evolving. So 2 obvious problems I see in the way we're approaching the subject. Everybody who's been following this for the last decade knows that this subject lends itself to lots of rich diagnostics. And some of the best and the brightest have flooded this zone and are covering, tracking, monitoring everything. There is much less focus on solutions, prescriptions to the problem. You know, the so-called, we get stuck admiring the problem, and there's a lot to admire. So I really put that on the table as we've got to switch gears. And got it. It'll keep getting worse, and it'll keep evolving, but we've got to start turning our attention to the other side of the equation. Second side of the problem of our approach is I believe that our core commitment to freedom of expression sometimes gets lost when we're trying to address the problem. There is a strong instinct, especially among governments, to address the problem by focusing on the content they do not like because you know, it undermines state control of the information realm or the political security of the state. So in effect, the government responses themselves to this problem in the information realm also undermine free expression and democracy. So we have to address both of these sides, and we have to get this combination right. Pre-digital, it was hard enough. Now in the digital context, much harder. There's no question our democracies are being weakened by the rampant spread on digital platforms of disinformation, polarization. That's what everybody here knows. And what we don't spend enough time talking about, this conversation is really about, is getting our heads around why is that such a threat to democracy? That's what's so great about how they framed this. It's not just harmful content, bad stuff. It's impact on democracy itself, and that's part of how we turn the corner. Access to trustworthy information is the lifeblood of democracy. Citizens cannot participate in representative government if they don't have access to information they trust and they don't share an information environment with other citizens with whom they must engage. And I think we need to develop that theme. Failure to address the challenges in the information realm is not an option for democracy because it's undermining democracy. But failure to do it in a way that undermines free expression principles is also not an option. So we've got to do that trick. I could say a lot more on, you know, conflict situations, that, you know, how certain circumstances, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, have helped this problem explode even further. The relevance of generative AI, which everybody is justifiably freaked out about, turbocharging this problem, also has some potential on the detection side. I will stop.
Thanks, Eileen.
Yeah.
That was great. And so you put on the table sort of both the idea of finding solutions, but also this problem of solutions sometimes also have this kind of feedback loop that can undermine freedom of expression, which in turn has an impact on sort of the set of solutions that we think are available to us. I want to turn to Adam Cooper next. And again, introduce yourself and sort of respond, if you can, to some of what Eileen said, and present your take on it.
Thank you, Dave. So I'd like to start by asking who the our is in the our democratic informational environment. Because I don't want to get too philosophical, David, but there's a risk, in my view, when we're talking about these problems of disinformation, that we're focused on where you started, which is Trump, the views, essentially, of Western democracies, right? So I come with the baggage of, I guess, my own personal experiences and the organization I work for, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which works in conflict zones, right? We do discrete dialogue on peace agreements. And my weird job is to adapt that to the digital domain. And so, I spent 7 years in Myanmar before I took on the role that I have now, and you guys know that as kind of ground zero for how disinformation and hate speech has real life consequences for people. And so when we're talking about our democratic informational environment, I would encourage us to broaden our lens, to think about the Myanmars of this world. And not just the top tier conflicts which we see in the New York Times, but the Sahel, Cameroon, parts of Thailand, Nigeria, the set of countries which are struggling through some kind of fragile democracy or are in conflict in some way, where the solutions, I would say, are less obvious, right? Because we're trying to pull the regulation lever, especially out of Brussels and Washington. That's essential. We've had some discussions this morning, Anne-Marie and I, about how you can leverage that for conflict zones. But we've got to think beyond, I think, just the existing levers we have. The little bit which we're trying to test as an organization that kind of focuses on peace agreements is, what does a digital version of that look like, right? If you're talking to political parties about their behavior and not exacerbating violence in the real world, can you talk to them about their behavior online? And we've been trying that for the past few years. It's really hard. People don't want to talk about their digital capabilities. You've got to have the right incentives for them to do so. But my feeling is, if we're going to talk about kind of disinformation and what we do about it, you can think about distribution of it from the platforms, you can think about consumption of it, but someone's got to be thinking about the production of it. Where is it coming from? How do we engage the people who are producing it? It's not going to be possible everywhere, but my feeling is that we have to try. And at the same time, we've got to find a way to incentivize the platforms themselves to care more about these places. And beyond what is just in the headlines right now, it's easy to scale up your response to Israel and Gaza. It's easy to scale it up on Ukraine. I mean, I say easy, they're pressured to do so. But everything else, where the places we work, we don't see those incentives there. And we've got to find a way to reshape that.
Great. That was great, Adam. And so we're sort of moving in a way from some like sort of general call for solutions and the problems there to some specifics and thinking about the framing of our problem. So I want to turn next to Eloisa Massaro and give us your take, Eloisa.
Thank you, David. So hello, everyone. My name is Eloisa. I am director at Internet Lab, which is a Brazilian-based think tank on law and technology. So just to start a conversation, I have 3 points that relates with the challenges we have been speaking on how to tackle harms to the information environment. So the first of all that has been cut across our work over time is that when we think about like how the internet transformed off our information environment, we cannot forget that the boundaries between online and offline are illusory. And in this sense, we cannot disconnect the digital from the context and from the social political context. And in this sense, looking at the user, it's key also to understand the problem and how to tackle that. And I'll give just a quick example. We have been doing this in the Internet Lab, and we found that in Brazil, a research we have done, a quantitative and qualitative research, that when we speak of disinformation, we cannot overlook the declining trust in journalism and official institutions, because when we speak with people, and as they get more suspicious of the information environment for a variety of reasons, they start to develop their own practices to access trustworthiness of sources and reliability of information. And this includes political affinities. This includes religious beliefs. I mean, how they will believe on their sources and information nowadays does not rely anymore on journalism paradigms or on scientific paradigms. So it's really important to understand how people are building trust. The second point is that if we consider that the issue of disinformation or of the integrity of the information ecosystem, it's so complex. We need to engage with different actors, and this is speak directly with the project we have brought to the Paris Peace Forum that engaged directly with digital advertisement industry. Because, I mean, the advertisement, this is an example. We truly need to engage with different actors. It's not just the responsibility of the private sector or the public sector. So, I mean, we do know that the advertisement industry has always had a key role on the information ecosystem, and speaking with them, so to bring their conversation with them is also key, and that's what we have done. And the third point, and that's my last one, that has a deeply conversation with what Ellen was saying, it's that it's only possible to have a truly democratic information ecosystem if it's truly free and plural. And this means that we cannot really fail on countering the harms, but we cannot counter the harms at the cost of rights. And I mean, going deeper on that, it also means that when we are approaching freedom of speech, we can approach it from a truly participatory perspective. What does this mean? This means that from our perspective, freedom of speech does not exist on its own. It needs conditions to be achieved so people can speak and be heard. And this means that if an environment is violent or it's not safe for people to speak, they are not exercising the freedom of speech. So violence also counters the ability of an information ecosystem to be truly democratic. And last example to close is that in the same research we have done on drivers of political communication, we found out that women during the elections in Brazil due to polarization felt way more insecure to speak about their political views than men during the electoral period. So that's the 3 points for starting.
Great, that was great, and really like raising the gender disparity I think is really quite important here. Okay, so we've sort of covered so far this first issue, at least according to what we have in our little run of show. And there's a few others who I want to offer an opportunity to sort of weigh in on what we've talked about, basically in terms of framing the problem so far. So I don't know if Eli or Noreen, would you like to? Mm-hmm.
Thanks, David. And I took you at your recommendation and junked all my written remarks and prepared notes.
Great.
And so now I'm like completely off the cuff. So I'm sure my team is going to panic. I think I don't have much to add. We've had such a rich discussion. I guess 2 or 3 points I did quickly want to make. And hi, I'm Noreen Fink. I'm the executive director of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. We need a shorter name. One, I think it is really important. We've been talking about how the corrosion of democratic space, largely in states, right? And we talked about the effects of misinformation, disinformation on that. I think the problem's also more widely conceived in that there is a corrosion of trust in many of the multilateral systems and kind of our collective international efforts to address many of these challenges. And I think, therefore, the threat as we're looking at it is in fact wider and more corrosive than we're talking about when we're talking about individual states. What does that mean? It not only makes it harder for states to make sure that they can protect democracy, it makes it harder for us sometimes to act collectively for some of the threats that we're facing, whether it's Sahel, Myanmar, Ukraine, Middle East. You know, we are seeing that erosion of trust in the values that underpinned the multilateral system. So I think that's important because it's affecting not just states, it's affecting international organizations and many of us who are working with them or rely on that set of values to do so. I mean, certainly our mandate focuses on counterterrorism in many spaces, and much of the misinformation and disinformation is not always led by terrorist groups, but we are seeing them exploit this, right? And so in many ways, we are seeing terrorists and violent extremists benefit from this corrosion in trust. And I think that is really part of the challenge. It's not always being produced by them, and it doesn't always sit comfortably in a counterterrorism mandate, but it's deeply creating an enabling environment for them. In our space, what we've been able to do with our member companies is provide research and support so that our member companies can work on identifying some of these harms and actually working to prevent it, and foster kind of real-time information exchange among our member companies as well. And I think that's really important because we bring big and small firms together, and a lot of these risks, you know, there's varying capacity to identify and analyze them. But I think one of the challenges many of us in the room face is one of silos, right? Counterterrorism, armed conflict, disinformation are often very separate policy streams, work streams, mandates, and things like that. So it's a bit of a challenge how we keep to kind of very clear missions and make sure we deliver on our missions while also understanding the overlap between these. And I think that's a gap all of us really struggle with. And finally, to reinforce a point I think I've heard from, you know, Eileen and Eloisa, we've spent about 20 years working on counterterrorism frameworks that balance kind of the need to act and secure spaces and people, but also make sure we do that in a way that protects human rights. And for GIFT-CT, where we have a strong commitment to human rights and deploying our tools in a human rights compliant manner, how action is taken to address these threats very much will affect that trust in kind of democratic informational spaces, right? And so I think reinforcing that point, how we deploy counterterrorism tools, how we make sure that governments react to the threat of disinformation, misinformation, and terrorist groups, that is really going to be a key standard on which we're judged.
Great, thank you, Noreen. Did you, yeah, Eileen, Eli? All the E's, you know, it gets in my head.
No, thank you, David. And really just to pick up on previous comments, I'm Eli Sugarman. I'm representing the Hewlett Foundation, a large philanthropy based in the Bay Area, and I wear a second hat at another philanthropy, Schmidt Futures. And what comes to mind for me is that disinformation is, of course, one of the many online harms that we're concerned about, in part because it can undermine democracy and really fray the bonds of society, whether one riveted by conflict or those fortunate not to be in a conflict situation. And so there are a couple things that stand out to me. One is that, putting on a philanthropy hat, disinformation is a challenge that affects all verticals that a philanthropic funder could care about. If you're trying to combat climate change, you're focusing on women's access to reproductive health care, whatever the case may be, there are malicious actors using disinformation to frustrate your purpose. And so just to say that I think that this is an issue that will continue to be very relevant, that unfortunately cuts across horizontally all the different verticals that any social justice or other funder could care about. And so we really need to spend more resources and time on it. That is both true in the United States and true globally. I think secondly, when I think about solutions, I think about disinformation as sort of nested within the trust and safety frame, if you will, which I know is a little bit more of an industry-centric term, but I think the ecosystem of civil society, university, and corporate players that is evolving to cohere into a trust and safety ecosystem really is holding a lot of promise when it comes to what is a solution that can be implemented at scale technically. How do you think about operations that scale? Where does the talent come from? And oftentimes when I think about the people, the actual people who are most values aligned to contend with this at all of the companies, small, medium, and large, they are within the trust and safety systems. And I think it is not a compliance function. It is very much, I'd argue, the front line of defense, keeping us all and our citizens and our allies safe. And so just to say, that's an area that I think, thankfully, some funders in the room and others are looking to channel more resources towards that could unlock new solutions and new partnerships. And let me stop there.
Great, Eli, thank you. I'm really just pleased so far. We are really surfacing such a range of issues. And it may be that our ambition to solve everything by the end will not be possible, but we're at least identifying problems. And I think this is fantastic. I want to turn to Mariana and then to Anne-Marie. As we're sort of, you know, at least according to our the way we've arranged this, we move to a second kind of like action-oriented focus, and I think we'll start to move in that way as well. I'll start with Mariana.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Mariana Diaz-Kraus. I'm from Colombia. My organization is Movilizatorio. It's a citizen engagement and social and transformation lab. And the project that we're working on, brought to the Paris Peace Forum, is on media literacy. And this is what I want to put my 2 cents in. It's, okay, of course we have all these problems, all these issues, but how, and all these researches, but how are we actually getting to citizens? And what are we giving to citizens to actually work with misinformation? I talk to my mother, she's 76. I tell her, Mom, do not send that WhatsApp. And she doesn't understand what's going on. So I think what we have to give everybody is tools. Especially citizens, we need tools to understand what misinformation is, what hate speech is, what misleading information is, and what truthful and the value of truthful information. So, for example, this curriculum for media literacy that we have created for young people in Latin America, for Spanish-speaking people in Latin America, gives these tools to kids and to their teachers to actually see, okay, how can you create critical thinking? How can you actually give tools to kids so that they know that the information they're consuming is truthful or not? And how are we creating tools and skills for citizens and for kids and for youngsters to actually create and share information that isn't misleading, and to actually take out these important factors that in the internet and the mass media gives us to share and to give more information in this vast sea of everything that could be positive but has a lot of negatives as well. So how could we actually educate? What tools are we giving them? So I think that is where we have to start going into action. So of course we identify, okay, platforms have this and this and that, media has this and this and that, but okay, how are we actually giving citizens the opportunity to participate in a rightful way, and keeping in mind that citizens are the basis of democratic programs and progress, because if they do not have the chance or the skills or the tools to actually go and vote appropriately, how are we going to do it? So we have to educate and have to give skills.
Great, thank you so much. This is the sort of the underlying theme that I'm hearing from several of our interveners is about the positive obligation of the state to do something. And so it's appropriate to turn to Anne-Marie, whose government, created, I think Denmark might have been the first to set up a kind of diplomatic outpost in Silicon Valley. And so I'm sure you've thought about these issues
Solve
pretty
them.
extensively. Solve them already?
Manage
So
them.
give us
Thank you
the
so much
playbook.
for coming, everyone. That was it. No, so I'm Anne-Marie Ingtoft-Melgar. I'm the tech ambassador of Denmark. Thank you so much for the very thoughtful and valuable insights so far. I think if I can go back to the problems just a little bit before becoming a solutionist here. One, we all know this, but democracy is truly suffering. Truly. In my own region where I come from, and the fact that we have these seeds that are being sown, whether democracy is really worth it. Is it a good system? Secondly, then democratic states, we're trying to defend ourselves in a game where we're not playing by the same rules. We're not hiring 300 journalists like Russia Today is to just create massive amount of disinformation. I don't have a team in a basement in Copenhagen thinking about how to artificially produce information against Russia, Iran, countries that are trying to do the exact same things. So we're not playing the same game. We're not playing by the same rules, and that is a challenge. And then in the meantime, as our democracy was suffering, in comes a series of platforms, and I think it's important that we recognize most of the platforms where we moved our democracy, they were not designed to be a fit for purpose thinking about Danish democracy 2.0. They were not created as a platform for nuances, for engagement, for protection of vulnerable citizens, minorities. Even in, I think, one of the most democratic states on earth, my own country, 60% of women do not engage in online debate because of the harmful content and honestly a very polarized conversation. 60%. How is that going to look in countries that don't have necessarily the same trajectory of protecting women? And so this is a challenge, I think, that is far beyond. And so some of the questions went to, so what are we doing on the regulatory side? And what would be interesting, I think, discussing here is how do we're trying to fix a problem, a Digital Services Act, illegal content, nasty content. For me, that is a floor, not a ceiling. The DSA in and of itself is not going to create stronger online democracies. We have to do that by also investing into platforms that are allowing for nuances, minority content, creators that have better visibility, people's right to information creation in a way where you don't get screamed at, minority content that is visible, that you can see, that you have access to in multiple languages. But the DSA does really well. I think it's setting some fundamental guardrails. It is the transparency requirements. It's just come out now how many content moderators in different languages that are among the big platforms. Some of the largest ones have 2 in Danish. I mean, we're a small country, 6 million people. Imagine for some of the other countries. I mean, we have some of them, some very important elections coming up. Someone said yesterday, 2 billion people are going to vote next year. The content moderators in some of these very, very large languages, very few. So to go into the solutions, Mariana, thank you so much, I think, for bringing both the educational, the awareness, the skills. I think there's something about how to incentivize democratic platforms that are optimized for democracy. They don't really exist, to my knowledge, and not in a sort of pervasive way. Secondly, how do we think about whether we play the game at their rules or changing the rules of the game? Right now, when we think about disinformation and freedom of speech, those who are really good at taking advantage of that is Russia. Right now, when we think about, I mean, the horrendous situation between Israel and Palestine right now, it is used to undermine democracy across the world. It is becoming the mother of all conflicts. And I think the siloed approach we used to have between disinformation and armed conflicts, well, no longer siloed. But we haven't really figured out an excellent example of that. I promise to also be a solutionist. I think what we do and what we sort of continue to do is engaging with the industry, taking perspectives and ideas that come from gatherings such as this one with the companies directly. We try to look at this obviously both from a domestic, but also, and secondly, and as important, thinking about Danish and European regulation. What are the ramifications, not least in more vulnerable settings? And it's not always that is the best vehicle for thinking about democratic dialogue in vulnerable settings. So how do we square those two into meaningful regulation that is helping both abroad and home? Thank you.
Great, Anne-Marie, thank you so much for that. And then you added, I think, in a way that maybe wasn't as, that we hadn't surfaced in the same way, this geopolitical aspect to this, which is really important and interesting. And maybe that's a good segue to Carol. And if you could either reflect on that or tell us a little bit about how you're seeing this in particular, because I know you do quite a bit of work in the MENA region and probably see all of these issues surfacing in a different kind of way, maybe reflective of what we've talked about, but also maybe a little bit different.
Yes, thank you. I will start from the last sentence of Anne-Marie. Do we play the game with their rules or change the rules of the game? And this is a very important question. So, hi, I'm Carol Sharabati. I'm based in Lebanon. I am an academic, but I'm also a consultant developing platform for fact checkers. So this is where my experience comes from. So disinformation is not new. It's been out there for ages, and it will never go away. It's been accompanying war all the time. What has changed is this click of a button, this easy way of sharing things and disseminating things so quickly. So that's the whole thing. And the impact of this is that the misinformation spreading has caused a lack of belief in anything. People, it's not that they believe wrong news. They believe no news anymore. We don't know what's true and what's wrong, so there's no more belief in the news. So the solutions have been coming from different ends. We know that there are some regulatory frameworks that have been created. Some also organizations have focused on the deontological approach for the journalists. Our approach has been bringing different additional dynamics to this, is to try to develop tools that can help fact checkers and maybe later on the masses verify the veracity of the information. So these tools are actually using the tools that are used to falsify the news. Let's use them in the other way and stronger and faster. the creating regulating framework and deontology are excellent, but they will take time. And this is spreading very fast. So it's a race. So we need to take these tools and flip them around and use them in a different direction. We need to, generative AI is not bad. It can be used for good reasons. So let's take it and use it for our own purposes, repurpose it and use it to detect the veracity of information. I'm using tool to detect veracity of images, veracity of videos, text, even the text. You can analyze the rhetoric, the lexic, the syntactic, the contextual, and you can detect whether a text is deceitful or not. Been doing a lot of this in the Arabic language, and this has been used by fact checkers. Now, what's interesting is that the fact checkers, they go on this platform and they detect disinformation. But the disinformation has gone to hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people. The fact checker's response is going to go to a few persons. So where's the answer? Is that every single citizen becomes a fact checker. Every single citizen has the capacity to detect the news and to respond to this. So that's one aspect. The second thing is that these tools can be used to detect misinformation, but they can also be used to produce faster good information. Let's support the journalists in AI and automated and smart machines that are properly trained so that they can produce as fast as the bad information, because the bad information is very easy to produce. So the good information takes a lot of time. So we need to also invest on these tools so that they facilitate the production of the journalists so they can even go faster. So in general, I would like to put on the table this thought that let's use the tools against those who are using them to disseminate misinformation.
Great. Carol, thank you for that. I like that sort of flipping it around. And again, I also like this move towards solutions. How do we address these problems? I want to give Jeff the chance to respond to, I think, of the people around the table with a little card in front of them. You haven't spoken yet, so I want to give it over to you, especially because I know you focus in particular on trust and safety kinds of issues. And then for those either who have one of these fancy things in front of them or not, think if there's a particular question you have, just raise your hand, or if you have one of these, you can put it up. But also you can just raise it, and I'll call on you, and we'll have about 20 minutes or so for discussion around the table. Let me turn to you first, Jeff.
Thanks, David. I believe I'm the person here representing private industry, so feel free to throw questions my way on that regard. But I'm Jeff Dunn, Vice President of Trust, Safety, and Support at Hinge, the dating app. Prior to that, that was just about 6 months ago. Prior to that, spent about 8 years at Google building out what is now their trust and safety operations and solutions. So that's more my background. And on the flip side, I am completely passionate with Anne-Marie, Eileen, and total agreement on the need for building tools to solve this, and also education. I think it's regulation, education, and tools are the three big things that we really need to get right, and we don't have created yet. I can tell you from the regulation side, having the guardrails in place, like DSA being the floor, not the ceiling, completely agree. That's been the approach that we took at Google to get everybody aligned and ready to go. But there's a lot more that needs to happen, not just restriction-oriented regulation, but actually a reward-driven regulation. So people like companies that I work for and other peers that I know are in the room, that we all actually have an incentive not just to meet the bare minimum of requirements, but actually go above and beyond and make it incentivized, not just a slap on the wrist of a fine or something. Tools I'm extremely passionate about. As someone who co-founded the Trust and Safety Hackathon, and to Eli's point, trust and safety is where all these decisions are made. I can tell you, we're in the private sector, we have to move faster than regulation. We have to move faster than most governments do as well. My team, for example, they're the ones making the day-to-day, hour-to-hour decisions on if that piece of content should stay up or come down. They're not checking with their government officials, they're not checking with law enforcement. They have to make real-time decisions pretty quickly. And the scale is, of course, tens of thousands of content moderators in Denmark, but also elsewhere, of course. And it's extremely important to get that decision right. So we have to do a lot of internal education. And I would love to basically take all of the learnings of trust and safety that I and my peers in the TNS industry have done and actually externalize that. So we train our content moderators. why don't we train our citizens in the same way of how to look at a piece of content, going to the media literacy topic, and make it easy and accessible. And then my last point is just simply on tools. You know, we held the Trust and Safety Hackathon yesterday, where we had about 100 TNS professionals, regulators, press, and more come to the Sorbonne, and we actually spent the entire day figuring out what tools and solutions could be built to stop disinformation, CSAM, illegal content in general. And we have a couple dozen ideas that we're going to push forward. And so there's a lot more room to grow. There's a ton of passion in the private sector, usually kind of behind the cloistered walls. But we're starting to see that break apart a little bit, thanks in a way to layoffs, but also just there's a real reason to actually get out and engage and do the right thing.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so we have 19 minutes and 28, 27, 26 seconds. So I wanted to maybe just to sum up what we've heard, although by no means doing justice to this, but one takeaway from the conversation so far is if we think about it in terms of players, actors who are involved in this. So we've got government, right? Government that is both, I mean, in the main, probably regulating right now or looking toward regulation. Then you have government bad actors too, as Anne-Marie was describing, that are in the manipulation side of things. We have companies, right? Companies that have to think about how do they do the trust and safety around these kinds of issues, whether it's disinformation or hate or something else. And then we have civil society. And I think we have really great representation of civil society here, thinking about education, response, global response, not just thinking in terms of particular regions. And I guess so I want to open it up to either if any of the people around the table, of the speakers want to ask a question or raise something that's been sparked that hasn't been said yet. And if there are no hands there, obviously to open it up to anybody else around the table so that this can be interactive. Like, have we hit upon the problems appropriately here? What are we missing? What should we be doing? Eileen?
I'll try to be really short.
Yeah, and we'll keep the answers to you.
Incredible. Everybody's great and too many ideas, but I love your structure of the actors. For me, maybe this is my weakness, but I have never trusted the trust and safety framing. It just feels, it hasn't felt like it's all that solid, but I think it's because of what Anne-Marie said, which is the platforms were not designed for civic discourse, high quality civic discourse, and to support democracy. And the question is, Adam, you started it, you said it, Eli, several of you brought up incentivizing the platforms to say, hey, we can embrace democracy, otherwise they're all gonna get really sick of us. So, why not? Why not choose, whether you call it their free expression or they want to operate in functioning societies with the rule of law and democratic values. And we've underdone that. And I will say, governments, our government is sort of confused right now about our relationship with the private sector. We cannot coerce them. We have to be careful not to coerce them. However, I love the idea of raising this issue and say, you get to do it, help us. I also think your points about media literacy, I mean, we have not, our eyes glaze over when we talk about media literacy. Nobody really funds it. It's not done at scale. It's piecemeal. It's a big deal. It's a big piece of the puzzle. Your idea about using generative AI tools on the positive side, again, incentivizing. They're in the process. We were talking about this last night, of making their rules. What is it they're screening for when they are controlling the models? This is the time to get in that room and help them say, we are going to choose this. And then last, on the role of government, change the rules of the game. I think we kind of all have an underdeveloped sense of what free expression is. And this is Evelyn, right? Freedom to seek, receive, impart. And part of free expression is forming opinions. We are forgetting the need of trustworthy information to form opinions and participate in democracy. It's not all about user speech. Somebody said, one of you, I don't know, either Noreen or Eloise, goes to the design question. Platforms don't have scientific or journalistic paradigm, you said, and I take that as sort of the ethics of journalism. They don't. And they could tilt in that direction. So, but I think governments have to play a role in rethinking what does free expression really entail if we want to protect our democracy.
That's great. And of course, when you say governments, I'm thinking, well, we're thinking about governments acting in good faith on these issues.
Correct.
But, right? Whether
Right.
we're talking about Myanmar or
Right. And then
Cameroon.
there's the our question. Who is us?
Yeah.
On global platforms. That's an underdeveloped idea.
Right, exactly. But even in democratic societies, I mean, we have, Texas and Florida
Yes.
sort of taking steps that make it harder to address disinformation, probably, for the platform. So super complicated. Wafa, did you want to raise? Yeah, and introduce yourself too, Wafa.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. My name is Wafa Ben Hassin. I'm on the responsible technology team at Midyar Network. I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces here. It's just excellent. So many partners that we work with. Eileen, may I change your mind on trust and safety?
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. It may be our best option.
It's that's kind of the conclusion I came to as well. And I wanted to share just a brief kind of context as to how we came to switching to that framework as well. So the portfolio that I lead at Midyar Network deals with private messaging platforms. And ultimately, we looked at a lot of the harms that our colleague from Colombia mentioned that actually traveled through Telegram, WhatsApp, Signal, et cetera. The biggest challenge with that was that we wanted to do it in a way that did not undermine privacy or undermine end-to-end encryption, which I think we can all agree around this table is a non-negotiable in terms of how we go about our business on a day-to-day basis. So ultimately, we found out that the question of how to keep people safe and also maintain their privacy was a question around balancing of rights. It's not about necessarily trade-offs. I know trade-offs always exist, but it's also about maintaining the holistic nature of human rights as universal and indivisible and inalienable. I think I started to take a more ecological approach to this issue, and trust and safety was something that really kind of came to the fore as something in this zeitgeist of companies laying off their human rights teams or ethics teams, came about the idea that it's actually researchers and engineers within the companies that are dealing with trust and safety issues. So ultimately, the idea is that you have to translate not only the work that the researchers are doing for trust and safety or looking at harms and elevating them, elevating their salience amongst society and why it matters, but we found that we had to really sustain not only the research, but also the researchers doing it that are constantly coming under attack in a lot of our democracies today. And so somebody mentioned Texas and Florida. That's exactly right. But even then, I think, insofar as regulation, yes, we all agree that it's a floor, not a ceiling, and it's not an end-all, be-all. But even when you have strong legislation, it's really hard to implement, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And how do we do that? And so ultimately, those are the questions we're dealing with today. And understanding the DSA as, the implementation of the DSA as a critical tool and working backwards from jurisdictions that have incentivized better behavior from companies to benefit the entire global majority is something that we take very seriously at Midyar Network. So ultimately switching to trust and safety, and again, really keen to explore this conversation more, but ultimately it came to be the most holistic, universal approach that we could take while bringing several equities to the table and several actors to the table and sustaining that kind of research.
Great, Wafa, that was a great statement for trust and safety, and absolutely further conversation. And hand here.
Thank you so much, David. It's Sasha Havlicek. I run the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. I wanted to pick up on Wafa's point, but look at the trust bit of that and come back to some of the points that were raised about transparency, which, of course, is at the heart of any system that can help us both deal with the harms online, but also ensure that we're not over-moderating so that it's not impacting free speech. And we see both of those things now really in, terrible technicolor in relation to the conflict now in the Middle East, of course, in relation to Ukraine, this massive proliferation of harm that we haven't seen the platforms really be able to get under control, and this terrible over-moderation of journalistic and citizen speech. So very, very problematic set of responses that we've seen. But so trust, the piece of the DSA that's been, I think, so important is in fact the mandated data access requirement of the Digital Services Act. This is the first time ever that not just regulators, but civil society organizations and research organizations, independent research organizations are going to be able to have access, we hope, if it works right, to data, providing the kind of ecosystem of scrutiny that we desperately need. So it isn't just in government hands or regulators' hands, that ecosystem then can scrutinize overreach by government, overreach by platforms, but also hold them to account. But that ecosystem will exist at an EU level. And so my question really is, with this data divide, data access divide that is emerging now over the coming months, how do we deal with this? How do we ensure, because everybody talks about leveraging the DSA, but the reality is that we won't be able to get data of that kind for the wider world. And all of these environments where, frankly, it matters a whole lot more in terms of the bottom line in people's lives, conflict and the rest. So really interested to know how we do that together.
Great. Sasha, that was fantastic and sort of highlights a whole number of things that we could address. So we had a hand here, and then I want to go back to Adam and then to Rose.
Hello, everyone. I'm João Branchi, Digital Policy Secretary at the Presidency in Brazil. I'm glad to hear all these different approaches and this multi-stakeholder approach for that. Just two informations and one invitation. We are testing a comprehensive approach to tackle disinformation, combining discussion on a regulatory approach on transparency, content moderation, democratic, with a due process, risk-based approach, and some discussion on how to tackle illegal content online. We're discussing media sustainability and all the debates on fostering professional journalism online and media literacy. We're training 300,000 professor teachers in the next 2 years on that. And we had a experiment on that last month that was really interesting. The second information is we are daring to bring this topic to the G20 Digital Economy Working Group. As you know, the G20 is a very complex environment for this debate, but we think that it's time to test a common ground that could go beyond like-minded countries, and that's something that we invite you to follow as well. And part of that, and the invitation, it's for an event that we're going to hold in May in Brazil on information integrity, trying to gather different players that have this agenda and trying to push this agenda internationally. Thank you very much, David.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Adam?
I wanted to let everyone here know how happy they're making my wife. She's a European official, and I think she would be very pleased with the glowing terms in which the DSA has been talked about it and the hope that's being placed in it. And with that in mind, I wanted to maybe suggest kind of two ways, at least for me personally, that I would appreciate the conversations going on beyond this room. The first is this theme which Sasha and Wafa and others have brought out about leveraging the DSA for the rest of the world, the global south, call it what you will. Because I think that we shouldn't forget that the DSA was written by European officials for Europe, right? There are ways, if we can get really creative, that we can find ways on the language provisions or data access, but it's an exercise in creativity, which requires getting minds around this table together. I would love to talk to people about that, because I feel that people around this table understand that legislation better than folk like us. The second thing I guess I want to say is, let's max out that regulatory piece. Let's do everything that we can there. But where that toolkit begins to fail us, what are the other levers we can pull? Right? When Brussels regulation isn't enough, and we don't want necessarily states in those countries regulating nationally in a way that's going to constrain freedom of expression, what other tools do we have available? That's a really hard question to answer, and I think we've got to talk about it more.
Yeah, that's a great last point. In fact, it was sort of the point that around the UNESCO regulations was such a core sort of concern about them, was like, how do you apply this in places that might not have the same kind of due process or rule of law kind of environment? I want to go to Rose, and I think there are a couple other questions. So I just want to, we've only got about a little less than 6 minutes, so just keep your interventions short, and then we'll just sort of sum up.
Will do.
Over to you, Rose.
Thanks. Just 2 quick points and one to hit on the DSA. I think in this, what gets missed often, though, and I'll give Eileen credit for your favorite phrase, the internet is systemic. And so as much as we like to talk about the EU, obviously, absolutely. In fact, even the language disclosures that we just saw are for the 24 EU member state official languages, which companies, frankly, didn't even hit that standard. We just happened to get some ancillary extra information out of it because none of them used the rules they were supposed to. But there is no version of the world where Europe gets to protect its democratic information environment if there's a complete mess happening everywhere else. It's just not possible. And so I think the hope on the DSA is the ways in which it's beyond just the creativity, the ways in which you bring home for EU officials who are creating co-regulatory mechanisms with work they've already done on mis and disinformation issues to understand the ways in which their own rules and their own interests are interlocked with understanding and having access and visibility for the rest of the world. That's still a creative twist, but I'm hoping we can do it. But the other thing I would say there is that the DSA, and I promise I will pass on, it's setting the standard. So regardless of whether it's the UK that comes next with its Online Safety Act, Brazil with rules, companies are one company. And a guy like Jeff has to take the rules created by every single country and region that comes up with an idea and figure out how to implement it. And if the EU is the first, which it is, at this level and scale, that's how companies are going to construct the internal tools that they have to answer the questions that we all want answered. So I would just encourage us to engage with the DSA right now for reasons beyond just the question of the EU, but because I do think it will be the leading standard on having access to any of the information on the inside that the rest of us need for all of the purposes you've discussed.
Great. Thank you, Rose. Excellent intervention. Yeah, Eli?
Very quickly, just to keep wearing the funder hat, to take advantage of the transparency requirements will cost tens of millions of dollars a year just in terms of like cloud compute, data engineering, and whatnot. Because if the data is made available through a series of APIs or some centralized system, you still need researchers to be able to manage it, access it, and turn it into real insights. That is hugely expensive to do if the data is shared at the scale we all hope it will, and nobody is stepping up to fund that. And so just to call out that like, it's gonna be great if there are terabytes of data, and then nothing will come from it. And so thinking about then how the usability, how the researchers, how the global majority interacts with that data, and where are those shared resources and infrastructure gonna live is absolutely critical. So just to say like, would love to also talk to people about that because like, I don't have the resources and the answer, but I do think that is a missing piece of it that demands more attention.
Always count on the funders to tell us, sort of, give us some reality. But that's a really important point, and it goes to the questions of, what, governments have been on the regulatory side, which is a kind of restrictive or demand side. To what extent are governments also willing to put in to make these things, kinds of things happen? Jason?
Yeah.
You're caught in between legs. Where are you going to go?
Yeah, so I don't have to lean awkwardly across your lap. I'll use this one. So, hi, Jason Pielmeyer. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Network Initiative. Just a couple of points. One, on the need to sort of leverage the DSA to get more access for global majority researchers. I just want to note, we did some work over the last couple of years together with DFR Lab, Internet Lab, and others to establish an action coalition under the Danish government's Tech for Democracy rubric on transparency. And one of the things we really are trying to focus on is getting groups like Internet Lab, Research ICT Africa, the Center for Communications Governance at the National Law University in Delhi, more plugged into these transparency discussions and engagements. And I want to tip the hat to WAFA, who helped support that work through Omidyar. So that kind of sort of foundation is starting to be laid, and there's a lot more that needs to be done there. And there's some really great research that Internet Lab and others are putting out. We just launched the transparency portal for that action coalition. So take a look at that. Hopefully that'll be helpful for folks. Secondly, on the point about trust and safety, I think one of the things, Jeff, your comments are really valuable and reassuring. One of the things we worry about a lot, though, is that the shift to regulation will turn what has heretofore been sort of efforts by companies driven by, internal desire to address concerns from advertisers, users, as well as sort of the external human rights-based framework into a compliance exercise that is essentially a legal sort of what's the sort of basic bottom line that we have to sort of be able to say we can do. And if we can say we can do those things, then there's really no incentive to do anything more. And so to the point about sort of the DSA and other regulatory frameworks needing to be a baseline, we can all say that as much as we want. But the reality is, we are seeing as companies go through their risk assessments, as we think about how these audits are going to work, that is really being driven by compliance, decision-making frameworks, lawyers within companies. Nothing against lawyers, but the role that they play within companies is not always the most proactive.
Yeah. Great. Don't you have a law degree, Jason? So I think, are we getting kicked out of the room? Since nobody is actually kicking us out of the room quite yet, let's just, a couple of very quick, wow, we've got a bunch of hands up, but I do think we're going to be kicked out of the room. But why don't I just, if you can really limit your, Paolo, are we going to get kicked out of the room?
No, not yet.
All right, so it's just us standing, in the way of your lunch. So we've got, I think I saw 4 hands go up. So why don't we just go around really quickly? I'll start with David and then Mira, and then 2 in the back, and try to keep them really quick, and then we'll wrap it all up. Thank you.
So David Green from Electronic Frontier Foundation. Hi, everyone. And just really quick, we've over the course of this hour, we've sort of really shifted from a solutions-oriented approach that looks at people who actually are using the information and trying to consume it. And I'm not a DSA fan, but otherwise, the regulation is really, really far from the users. And not just far in terms of doesn't really help them on a day-to-day basis. The timeline is really far off. I mean, the benefits we will see, if anything, from transparency are really far in the future. And right now, we actually have desperate needs for fixing our information ecosystem that I think are more efficiently focused on things like actually providing tools to the users directly and thinking about, from a consumer's perspective, how do I decide, how do I distinguish what is good information and is not? And to me, the most critical role for government is government is a powerful mouthpiece that has lots of social media followers and also has some built-in trust to it that sort of defies media literacy that it doesn't always earn. And I don't say that to be not malicious governments, but governments are as careless in putting out information as the rest of us are. And I would like regulators and companies to actually be working on improving their own information practices as really a first step, and really trying to think about from what is the user-centered approach to how do I both communicate in a way that is responsible as well as share and consume information in a way that I have some tools to figure out how that works. And I don't see that in a sort of research focused or transparency focused approach.
Thanks, David. Mira, and we've got to move quickly on this, otherwise, I don't know, the sort of the room gods. Well, we're okay now, but.
I'll try to be very quick. Thank you, David. Mira Milosevic, Executive Director of Global Forum for Media Development. I liked some of the comments that mentioned different stakeholders and different groups. And so on the side of the producers, when we talk about trust and safety, we focus mostly on the harms and creating systems and mechanisms that will address those harms. What we are desperately lacking is that link between producers who do have ethical trust and safety principles and their ability to send those signals into different systems for them to be recognized, and then for the users and everyone else, including advertisers, to know who are these players, especially in small markets and languages. And I feel and I know that we don't invest enough into that aspect of the story. So I'll stop there.
Super. Thank you, Mira. And here, yes.
Hi.
Great, thank you. That is a really great question. I wish we had another panel hour to answer it, but yeah, and you had your hand too,
I'll
please.
be very brief.
Thank you, and Carol, you're going to get close to the last word.
Very quickly, actually, reinforcing again on David, the citizen approach will move faster and allow to gain time while the regulations develop. And there is one layer to put on top of it. I wanted to throw this idea is to try to it's not only individual citizen capability, but it's also building a kind of a collective intelligence. So how does the sum of citizens that are detecting disinformation come together into a collective intelligence that even has a multiplying effect of these individuals? So it's about putting the tools in their hands, but also creating synergies and dynamics that amplify the impact of these tools.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Mariana, I know you had a hand, quick
Really,
response
really
to it?
quick, just to say, definitely policy is very far away from the reality of citizens. That's why I do urge on how do we get citizens to connect to this in a better way. And I loved your phrase on how could we make every citizen a fact checker. And that's how we have to do it, and we have to educate them. And so we have to educate them so that they understand the policies that are coming.
Great. So this was fantastic, and just a testament to the fact that you don't need to have any plan. If you have a lot of smart people in the room who, I mean, that's a bad lesson to there's no kids in the room, right? But really, thank you for our panelists and all of the questions from non-panelists. I mean, this is really fantastic, and I think we can come away from this maybe not with like a plan that we can take to the bank or something like that, but I think a lot of amazing ideas are on the table. We're very lucky that we had this combination of civil society with some amazing ideas, including funders who think about this from the level of like where's the best place to be putting money. So you saw who the funders were in the room. But also we had a company, but I think people with sort of understanding of the company perspective in here and governments. So really fantastic interaction. In a way, a model of what multi-stakeholder discussions should be about. And so maybe if I could just reinforce in part because for those of you who might go and participate in, GDC or other UN kinds of efforts in the coming weeks or months, this is how solutions, I think, get generated, not just when you put a bunch of governments in a room. I mean, no disrespect to governments, but that's not the way, at least historically in this space, that answers have come about. So thank you to everybody for being here. Hopefully, you can identify people and have conversations afterwards, because this was more like a conversation starter than anything else. But really appreciate. Thanks to the speakers. Thanks to everybody for participating.
Thank you.